In 1970, a manufacturing board approved a directive that restored production by bypassing negotiation. Authority did not collapse that year. It changed form. The company remained operational. Shareholders were reassured. Output stabilized within weeks. But the mechanism of authority had shifted. In stable systems, enforcement is rarely visible. Compliance precedes force. When enforcement becomes necessary, legitimacy has not vanished. It has narrowed. The directive was legal. It was framed as continuity. It resolved an immediate operational decline. What it altered was less immediate. Compliance without demonstration had ended. Authority would now require reinforcement, and reinforcement leaves residue. The company operated multiple domestic plants. Labor participation was high. Production slowdowns had begun appearing across divisions. Not strikes, not shutdowns, slowdowns. Output had declined 11% quarter over quarter. The board characterized it as coordination drift. Investors characterized it as instability. The directive invoked emergency production clauses embedded in prior agreements. Plant-level managers were authorized to bypass standard grievance cycles when scheduling or assignment changes were deemed operationally necessary. It was not framed as punishment. It was framed as stabilization. Production resumed within 3 weeks. Absenteeism declined. Union leverage diminished in the short term. Externally, the decision registered as discipline. Internally, it registered as demonstration. The board did not describe the move as force. It described it as clarification. Authority, once ambient, was now explicit. An explicit authority changes the contract beneath it. The decision worked. In its moment, it worked. Operational metrics improved, but compliance recalibrated. Managers began documenting interactions more rigorously. Supervisors escalated minor disputes to legal review. Union representatives formalized objections that had previously been informal conversations. Trust did not evaporate, it thinned. Authority had been demonstrated, and demonstration introduces accounting. When authority functions invisibly, resistance remains dispersed. When authority is enforced, resistance consolidates. Over the next decade, grievance filings increased significantly. Supervisor turnover rose gradually. Internal legal costs expanded. None of these indicators alone signal crisis. The company remained profitable, but the organization grew procedurally dense. Every directive required citation. Every adjustment required reference to policy. Every deviation required documentation. Authority had preserved output. It had also converted legitimacy into a recurring administrative expense. Machiavelli argued that it is safer to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. He wrote in a context where fear stabilized sovereign rule. Modern institutions do not operate under sovereign logic. Fear inside bureaucracy does not centralize power. It distributes it. It multiplies witnesses. It generates paperwork. It slows discretion. The enforcement stabilized authority in the short term. It reduced elasticity in the long term. The directive was not reckless, it was context-bound. In 1970, capital mobility was limited. Supply chains were geographically concentrated. Labor density was structurally embedded. Authority could be asserted internally without external amplification. By the 1980s, those conditions shifted. Production globalized. Union density declined nationally. Automation altered leverage. The enforcement architecture remained. Its necessity diminished. Managers continued operating under a model built for confrontation. Procedures designed for containment became standard practice. The success of the directive depended on conditions that no longer existed. Its cultural imprint did not disappear when its utility did. Authority had been stabilized within a narrow window. Its enforcement logic became permanent. Why does imitation of this model struggle today? Because authority now operates under distributed visibility. Enforcement no longer remains internal. Reputational consequences travel faster than directives. In the 1970 framework, friction remained contained within plant walls. In contemporary institutions, friction migrates instantly. Documentation systems amplify visible assertion, incentives invert. The more visibly authority is enforced, the more optionality drains from leadership structures. Context collapses faster than architecture adjusts. What once clarified authority may now signal brittleness. What once stabilized output may now destabilize legitimacy externally. The enforcement logic is portable. The environment that sustained it is not. And when context dissolves, authority reveals its scaffolding. The directive was never formally rescinded. It became procedural background. New executives inherited it without recalling its origin. Authority remained intact, but it required maintenance. Not because production faltered, not because collapse loomed, because once enforcement becomes foundational, it rarely withdraws quietly. It embeds, it reshapes expectations. It narrows the space in which authority can operate without demonstration. There is no single moment when enforcement becomes dependency. There is only gradual substitution, legitimacy replaced by repetition. The company endured. The board retained control. The cost was not failure, it was friction. Friction accumulates slowly. It does not announce itself as loss. It settles into the structure and remains there. It becomes administrative. The language that once justified urgency turns into boilerplate. Clauses written for instability become standard reference points. Managers who did not witness the original slowdown inherit the procedures without inheriting the tension that produced them. The architecture persists even when the threat does not. An architecture, once embedded, begins shaping decisions independent of its origin. New disputes are interpreted through older assumptions. Neutral events are processed within adversarial frameworks. Authority responds preemptively where it once responded proportionally. Nothing dramatic occurs. There is no singular rupture, no public reckoning. The system continues operating, but its tolerance narrows. Flexibility declines in increments too small to notice individually. What required enforcement once becomes what assumes enforcement always. And in that assumption, authority changes again. Not weaker, not stronger, more conditional, dependent on its own reinforcement. The original directive restored production. It also redefined the boundary between legitimacy and demonstration. That boundary does not vanish. It lingers, quietly shaping decisions long after the conditions that created it have dissolved. The file does not close because the decision failed. It remains open because the cost never fully leaves. It simply integrates into routine, into expectation, into structure. And structure rarely announces what it carries forward.